My name is Tom Painter, and I'm a research scientist at the NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory. JPL was the very first NASA center in response to Sputnik and JPL providing the Explorer 1 launch back in 1958, and through the years. JPL helped to develop the soft landing on the moon that led to Apollo 11 and exploration of the solar system. And with the exploration in the solar system, then we started looking for water in the solar system, because where we find water on Earth, we find life. And so the technologies that have been developed at JPL for exploring the solar system, and in particular looking for water, we're turning around and looking at the Earth in this particular case. And so that's how I was brought into to JPL, and in particular to look at water resources and water cycle science.
That's what I was wondering about, because NASA obviously does many things, but it's associated in the public's mind with space exploration.
Right.
So I was curious how it came about that you began looking at better measurement of water resources here.
Yeah, well, it's important for people to know that the very first NASA mission, so the Explorer 1, discovered the Van Allen belts. So it was Earth science from the very beginning, and in the NASA mission statement, Earth focuses quite prominently there. And learning about the Earth and learning about processes on Earth is key then to helping us to understand what we're looking at out in the solar system. The program at JPL started out really in the 2000s, starting to look at water resources more intensively, and then I was brought in 2010 with the intention of building a snowpack related, water resources related program. And so very soon after I got there, I went to my old friend Frank Gerke, who's the chief of the California Cooperative Snow Survey Program for the Department of Water Resources, and talked to him about this idea that I had about how we could measure the snowpack wall to wall, and finally get past many of the uncertainties that have plagued them in their snowmelt runoff forecasts. And fortunately, we had this long relationship before that, and so there was a lot of trust in the very beginning, and we were able to partner on this from the very beginning. And so we pursued the program from a water cycle science standpoint to fill that void in our understanding of the snowpack, how it's changing with respect to climate change, what it's going to do for these kids' water resources in the future, and then likewise in working with Frank from the very beginning, we were considering the water resources, water management needs from the very beginning. So from before we even had any hardware or much software at all, we were starting to work on the operational program with them as well.
So once you actually launched the aerial surveys, I mean, did you start that in 2011? What year did that begin?
We started working on it in 2011. We did our first snow-free flights as baseline in 2012. Our first flights in California were at the same time that the Curiosity rover landed on Mars. So we didn't make the media splash that we would have hoped to. But then in the spring of 2013, in fact, April 3rd, 2013 was our first flight of snowpack.
Okay. How does it work with the LiDAR and with the fixed wing, and compare that to the accuracy of the old-fashioned way?
Right. So the old-fashioned way, really, it started in the early 20th century. Dr. James Church, he was a professor at the University of Nevada, Reno. He was a humanities professor, but he had this great interest in answering the question of the Lake Tahoe lake level and really what was controlling that. And so he worked on building the snow tube which is often called the federal sampler, or by those of us in the community, the Mount Rose sampler, because that's where he deployed it, up on Mount Rose, right at the end of the lake over there. And that really is the home of snow hydrology for the world over there. And then that expanded into programs in California, where the surveyors will ski along, plunge the snow tube in, pull it out, weigh it. It's quite accurate most of the time, but it's a very sparse measurement, and they have to ski many miles off to the next site, and then off to another site, and so it's not a full sampling of the snowpack.
And labor intensive.
It's very labor intensive, but it also is really important even for us going forward. All right, so the way I like to think about it is that that it's like the snowpack across the mountains is like your TV screen. And what those snow courses with the snow tubes provide is every once in a while you have a pixel turned on the TV, right? And through the years, through 30 years of those pixels continuing to turn on, you get a fair idea of how much water you're going to get out of the mountains, right? But you do not have the complete picture. And there's quite a bit of uncertainty in those relationships developed from those sparse measurements. So we've known in the snow hydrology community and the hydrology scientific communities for years that we had a very uncertain quantification of the mountain snowpack. And so in the late 2000s, several of us looked at what these new technologies were that were coming along, and LiDAR in particular, which is like a laser radar. It measures how far away an object is, was able to provide us the kind of measurement that we needed to have wall-to-wall measurements. And that technology had really come along in a way that we could fly high, cover the mountains, not run into the mountains, but be way above them, and yet make the measurements all across the snowpack to measure that snow topography. We do it when there's no snow on the ground, and the difference between the two is the snow depth. Now, that's not all of the picture. The whole picture is snow water equivalent, which the snow tube gives us.
The content.
Right. So, but fortunately, the variability across the landscape of snow water equivalent comes primarily from the variability in snow depth. The snow density, which is the other part of the picture that you need to know how much that depth turns into water, it doesn't vary much across the landscape, and how it does is predictable. And so we knew that if we measured the snow depth, then we could really get an accurate picture of that spatial distribution of snow water equivalent. The other piece of the measurement is what's called the imaging spectrometer, and that measures the reflected sunlight in about 100 different colors, some in the visible wavelengths and some out in the wavelengths that we can't see in the near infrared. And that's where the bulk of the interaction of the sun with the snowpack goes on and controls how much energy is absorbed by the snowpack and how fast it's going to melt. You hear a lot about temperature influences on snowmelt, but really the influence of temperature comes in changing snow to rain falling out of the sky. That's where its big influence is. Absorbed sunlight represents about 90 to 95% of the energy that goes to melting snow. And so knowing how dark or bright that snow surface is tells you dramatically, with the kind of accuracy that you want, how fast it's going to melt. And so combining those two measurements then allows us to map the snow water equivalent and its reflectivity, and those two are the big dogs in understanding the timing and magnitude of snowmelt runoff. It's enormously accurate. Yeah, it's so the uncertainty is about 8 centimeters for the vertical measurement of snow depth across an area about this size, right? But there's no bias in it. So when we average that up to 50 meters, which is where we make the estimate of snow water equivalent, those errors that we have, those 8 centimeter errors, damp out so that across a 50 meter area, our uncertainty is less than a centimeter in that snow depth. And then the snow density, that's a combination of modeling and the measurements that we have either from the snow courses or the snow pillows, which came into use in the 1980s when people finally figured out what to do with a waterbed. And you put it in the ground and measure snow. So the combination of those measurements that we have out on the landscape with the modeling gives us a very accurate measurement of the snow water equivalent. And so what we have found now with the modeling of how much water is coming out of the mountain basins in the spring is about, the uncertainty is a little less than 2%. And from the historical measurements, the snow pillows and the snow tubes, the forecasts from those, when it's an average year, their forecasts can be quite accurate. They can be in that 2% uncertainty range. When there are excursions, either dry year or wet year, and warmer year or colder year, that throws off those old models. And so we end up with forecast errors. In about half of the years, those forecast errors of how much water is going to come from April 1 out through the end of runoff, those errors are greater than 20%. And in 1 in 5 years, those forecast errors are 40% or greater. And, averaging across 10, 20 years, well, they do pretty well. But people's lives are impacted by those individual years that are being averaged out. And with a changing climate, with more rain falling, and likewise more requirements on the runoff coming out of the mountains, greater dependency, as well as a greater federal requirement on environmental flows. What we used to be able to get by with in those forecast errors, we can no longer get by with those. We can't afford those costs. We can't afford those uncertainties. And so being able to follow those excursions from year to year and take those errors all down very close to 0% is key. And fortunately, this quantification of the snowpack has been hugely successful in that direction, even far exceeding what our expectations were going to be of how powerful this resource was going to be.
Okay. For example, Friant Water Authority. Why do they care so much about this? What's the benefit for them?
Well, so Friant Water Authority is a collection of farming entities, and the number one water resource for them comes from the snowpack. In the annual precipitation in California, about 80% of what falls onto the state of California comes in the form of snow. So being able to quantify that from year to year is absolutely key in having that reliable estimate early on in each season to know how much water there's going to be, and likewise for their agreements and moving of water, and being able to let their entities know whether there's going to be a shortfall, there's going to be surplus, what to do about groundwater recharge, etc. So it takes them from a highly uncertain world that their lives were saddled with being in that business to removing that uncertainty and letting them really focus on optimizing what it is that they intend to do.
So in some ways, does it almost take the place of additional surface storage because it allows them to maximize what they've got?
That's right. As they like to say, you can't manage what you don't measure. And it was pretty remarkable that DWR and other entities have been able to forecast as well as they have with just those very sparse measurements. But we feel really fortunate to have been in the place to be able to bring this to the point that we can really optimize that most critical of resources that's allowed this civilization to exist out here.
So DWR obviously benefits too because it helps them to manage reservoirs and to know how much capacity exists for the runoff that may be coming.
That's right, and to allow them to make those more accurate forecasts, to help with their flood control program, to help with their push to honor new requirements on groundwater, and to help the entities such as Friant and other irrigation districts, municipalities, with optimization of groundwater recharge, and as well as the operational flexibility between them. There are many tangled relationships that hinge on the knowledge of the water resource, and those entities through the decades have simply had to accommodate these large uncertainties, and they've had to hedge because of these large uncertainties. And at least for this part and the downstream effects, we've been able to really reduce that hedging.
What about other benefits? Does CAL FIRE, is there a benefit for CAL FIRE?
Yeah, absolutely. So every time we fly the mountains, we touch the trees with laser pulses, and we fly several times through the spring, and so we can take those laser returns and fuse all of them from various acquisitions into a very high resolution picture of every tree and how much biomass it has. And likewise with the spectrometer on board, it allows us to have an understanding of the health of that tree. So how likely is it to be sucking water, or is it dead? And then from a scientific standpoint, feeding back to the understanding, how much runoff are we getting in places where there's this intense tree mortality? Are we starting to see more runoff because those trees are simply not active anymore? And not just CAL FIRE, but also the U.S. Forest Service, from their forest knowledge, and likewise transportation, recreation. We have these very high resolution measurements of snow depth. Well, all the trails, the Pacific Crest Trail, right? That we can now tell people where there's snow, when it has melted out, and then likewise understanding for Caltrans with respect to some of the Trans-Sierra roads, so Tioga Pass, Sonora Pass. What's the snow depth across those roads, and where do they need to put in the most intensive work on plowing? So yeah, we've identified many of these applications, but we also know that once we put these data in the hands of the younger generations who are not afraid of terabytes of data, they will really start to explore the even greater utility that we've never thought of. We also have spent quite a bit of time talking with the Sierra Nevada Conservancy, which is part of the state government, discussing the idea. They have a great interest in the quantification of the Sierra forests, and so they're looking at the idea of maybe a decadal scale survey, very high resolution of the forests. And then the snow surveys, given the fact that we do touch the forest, but not nearly as high a density as they would like to have, we could still use that to provide an annual measurement of what's going on with that forest health in between those high resolution surveys, and again the water, the snowpack, the forests, those are all key as resources, and the control on those resources for the state of California and for the West in general.
Cal Fire again.
Yeah.
So you're talking about being able to give them data that helps them recognize the health of the forests, what's dead, what's dry, and that helps them map out, I guess, what expectations about fire dangers. Would you say?
Yeah. So they can look at fire danger. This information we're using now in models with collaborators at JPL. To have an idea of how the fires are going to burn, and those have then been used on fires that have happened. For instance, the King Fire just over the ridge here, and so having that idea and understanding these mega fires that we're having now, but also being able to understand the interaction between snowpack, snowmelt, the tree utilization of that water, and so how the changing snowpack is affecting the forest health, and likewise how the forest health is affecting the snowmelt runoff. And both of those really are key to the synergy between the forests and the snowpack, and ultimately to that water resource.
Okay, expansion. You obviously measure a fairly limited part of the Sierra.
About a third of the Sierra right now.
Is it the San Joaquin and the American River watershed?
No, we right now we run from the Tuolumne down through the Merced, the San Joaquin, the Kings. This year we're adding the Cahuilla, and then basins over on the east side as well. And we're right at the limit of what one aircraft can do with the kind of repeat frequency that's needed.
So what would you like to see?
Well, my goal with my life is that I'm going to see this implemented around the western U.S., and that's going to require multiple aircraft. A lot of people ask, well, can't you do this with satellite? The satellite programs that we're working on with NASA are really headed toward a global perspective, and not so much with the high resolution measurements that we would need to have frequently across the entire Sierra Nevada, across the Colorado River Basin. And so what we're looking at is multiple aircraft flying, and being able to process those data very rapidly like we do right now, and providing that snapshot of snowpack that then also is input into these snowmelt runoff models that tell us total amount of water that's going to be coming out in the spring, and likewise how much is coming tomorrow, how much is coming across the next week, the next 10 days. And it sounds like a lot of growth and a lot of money, but the return on investment of that right now, the best estimate is that it's about 100 to 1, which is very good return on investment.
So you'd like to see, just specifically in terms of California, the entire Sierra Nevada range covered?
Yeah, the entire Sierra up to the South Cascades, the Trinity Alps, the Klamath, everywhere that snowpack is an important resource.